In the high desert of northern Arizona, where the wind carries the scent of sagebrush and red dust paints the horizon at sunset, there's a stretch of land that's been in one family for over 80 years. It's not flashy. No neon signs, no fancy gates, just a weathered wooden fence, a few scattered cottonwoods, and a small ranch house with a porch that creaks under the weight of time and memory. This is where Deshaun Ellery lives, works, and breathes. Deshaun didn't grow up dreaming of city lights or corner offices. From the time he could walk, he was trailing behind his grandfather, learning how to read the sky for rain, how to mend a broken fence post with nothing but wire and grit, and why you always leave a little water in the trough for the wild jackrabbits. His grandfather had come to this land after serving in the army decades ago, not as a hero looking for glory, but as a man seeking peace, space, and a place to build something that would outlast him. He bought 40 acres with his savings, cleared the rocks by hand, and planted the first seeds of what would become a working ranch. Now Deshaun tends to that same land with the same quiet care. He raises heritage cattle, breeds that can handle the dry heat and sparse grass, and grows crops like tepary beans and drought-tolerant squash, the kind his ancestors relied on long before supermarkets existed. But his ranch isn't just about survival. On weekends, he opens his gates to local kids, teaching them how to rope, how to check soil moisture, or how to tell if a calf is healthy just by the sound of its breath. He doesn't charge a dime. Knowledge, he often says, is the one thing that grows when you give it away. For years, the nearest neighbors were miles away, ranchers, retirees, a few off-grid homesteaders who valued privacy as much as open sky. But about 5 years ago, things started to change. Developers began buying up empty parcels to the east and south, carving the desert into neat grids of cul-de-sacs and cookie-cutter homes with names like Sagebrush Estates and Desert Haven. At first, Deshaun didn't mind. People needed places to live, and as long as they respected the land and kept their distance, he figured there was room for everyone. Then came the Homeowners Association. It started quietly. Flyers in mailboxes, community potlucks, promises of enhanced safety and property value protection. Most of the new residents signed up without a second thought. But Deshaun, whose ranch sat just outside the official subdivision lines, was never invited to join. Not that he wanted to. He'd seen how HOAs operated in other towns. Endless rules about lawn height, paint colors, even what kind of trash cans you could use. His life ran on a different rhythm, one shaped by seasons and soil, not by bylaws. Still, he tried to be neighborly. When a storm knocked down a power line near the edge of his property, he let a crew cross his land to fix it. When kids from the new neighborhood wandered too far and got lost near the arroyo, he drove them home in his old pickup, muddy boots and all. He figured mutual respect was enough, but respect, it turned out, wasn't on the agenda. One Tuesday morning, Deshaun woke before dawn, as he always did, to check on a heifer that had been acting restless. As he stepped onto the porch with his thermos of coffee, something felt off. The usual view, the long dirt road leading to the county highway, was gone. In its place stood a tall chain-link fence, stretching as far as he could see in both directions, topped with coiled security wire that glinted coldly in the first light. His stomach dropped. He walked out in his boots, still in his flannel shirt, and followed the fence until he found it. A heavy steel gate blocking the only driveway that connected his ranch to the outside world. There was no note, no warning sign, just a keypad mounted on a metal post and a small logo stamped into the gate. Sagebrush Estates HOA, authorized access only. Confused and frustrated, Deshaun called the county road department. They told him the access road was technically a private easement, maintained by the original landowners decades ago. Then he called the HOA office. A recorded message said the office was temporarily closed for administrative review. He left 3 voicemails. No one called back. Days passed. He tried using an old service trail that cut through a dry wash behind his barn, a rough, rocky path meant for emergencies, not daily use. But his truck got stuck twice, and hauling feed or vet supplies that way took hours longer than it should. One afternoon, he saw a group of HOA board members walking the fence line with clipboards, pointing and nodding like they were inspecting a construction site, not someone's home. Finally, he showed up at their monthly meeting, held in the community clubhouse that smelled of new carpet and disinfectant. He stood in the back, arms crossed. listening as they discussed landscaping budgets and speed limits. When the floor opened for community concerns, he raised his hand. "I'm Deshaun Ellery," he said, voice calm but firm. "My family's ranch has used that access road since 1946. You put a fence around it without notice. I need a gate code." The room went quiet. The HOA president, a man with a pressed polo shirt and a name tag that read Lyle, cleared his throat. "Mr. Ellery, we understand your situation, but the gate is for residents only. Your property is zoned agricultural, not residential, so you don't qualify for access under current HOA guidelines." "That road isn't yours," Deshaun replied. "It's an easement. And my driveway runs right through it." Lyle smiled thinly. "We've consulted legal counsel. For now, the gate remains. We'll revisit the matter, eventually, no apology. No timeline. Just bureaucratic fog." Deshaun left without another word. But that night, sitting on his porch under a sky full of stars, he made a decision. He wouldn't shout. He wouldn't threaten. But he wouldn't be erased either. His grandfather had fought to keep this land when banks and big developers wanted it. Now it was his turn, not with anger but with patience, paperwork, and the kind of quiet determination that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. He pulled out his laptop, opened the county assessor's website, and started digging. If they thought a fence could shut him out, they didn't know who they were dealing with. Because on this land, fences didn't define boundaries, history did. And history, Deshaun knew, always had the last word. The gate stayed locked. Day after day, Deshaun watched it from his porch like a silent challenge. At first, he tried to stay calm. He reminded himself that anger wouldn't fix a broken system, but action might. Still, every time he had to take the back trail, bouncing over rocks, dodging mesquite branches that scraped the side of his truck, he felt the weight of something deeper than inconvenience. It was disrespect. And it stung. He started keeping a journal, not the kind filled with emotions, but one packed with facts. Dates, license plate numbers of HOA patrol vehicles, photos of the fence posts driven into ground that had once been open range. He recorded every unanswered email, every voicemail that vanished into digital silence. He even noted the weather because on dry days, the dust from his detour trail would coat his cattle's water troughs, and he'd have to clean them twice as often. Neighbors from the new subdivision rarely spoke to him now. When they did, it was with awkward smiles and quick excuses. One woman walking her dog crossed the street when she saw him coming. Another rolled up his car window as Deshaun waved from his gate. It wasn't outright hostility, more like a quiet distancing, as if his very presence had become inconvenient to their idea of a perfect community. But not everyone turned away. One afternoon, as Deshaun wrestled a flat tire on the service trail, an older man in a faded denim jacket pulled up in a dusty pickup. Without a word, he got out, grabbed a wrench from his bed, and helped Deshaun change the tire. His name was Ray, and he lived 3 miles down the county road outside the HOA zone, but close enough to see what was happening. "They think fences make them safe," Ray said, wiping grease off his hands. "But all they're really doing is building walls between people." Deshaun nodded. "I just want to get feed to my animals without spending half my day on a goat path." Ray chuckled. "You ever check who actually owns that strip of land where they put the gate?" Deshaun paused. He'd assumed the HOA owned it, or at least had legal control. But Ray's question stuck with him. That night, after feeding the calves and checking the irrigation lines, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of strong tea and reopened the county property records online. He typed in the parcel number for the access road, the narrow ribbon of dirt that had been his lifeline for generations. The screen loaded slowly, and there it was. The land wasn't owned by the HOA. It wasn't even owned by the developer who'd built Sagebrush Estates. The deed listed 2 names, Elena and Mateo Garza. The address? Albuquerque. The last recorded tax payment? 2 years ago. Deshaun blinked. So the HOA had built a gate on someone else's property and locked out the one person who actually needed to use it. He felt a flicker of hope, but he didn't get ahead of himself. Hope without proof was just wishful thinking. He printed the deed, highlighted the boundaries, and called a lawyer he'd heard about through a farming co-op, a woman who specialized in rural land rights and didn't charge upfront fees. She listened carefully, asked a few sharp questions, then said, "If what you're telling me is accurate, they've overstepped. Big time, but we need to move carefully. Don't confront them. Don't post anything online. Just keep documenting. Deshawn took her advice. He kept his head down, kept working the ranch, and kept driving the rough back trail, even when a summer storm turned it into a muddy ditch and he had to tow his truck out with a tractor. But inside, something had shifted. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He was planning. Meanwhile, the HOA began ramping up its presence. Security cameras appeared on the fence posts. A new sign went up. Trespassers will be prosecuted. One morning, Deshawn found a notice taped to his mailbox. Official-looking letterhead. Dense legal language, claiming his unauthorized use of private HOA infrastructure could result in fines or legal action. He read it twice, then tucked it into his journal. Evidence. Around the same time, a local news station caught wind of the story. A young reporter showed up with a camera and a microphone, asking if he'd be willing to talk. Deshawn hesitated. He didn't want this to become a spectacle, but he also knew silence could be mistaken for surrender. He agreed, but only if they focused on the facts, not the drama. No dramatic music, no angry neighbor labels, just the truth. A man trying to access his own land, blocked by a gate he didn't install and couldn't open. The segment aired on a slow Thursday night. It was short, just under 3 minutes, but it showed Deshawn calmly explaining the situation, standing beside his cattle, pointing to the fence in the distance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He just stated what had happened. For a few days, his phone rang nonstop. Some callers offered support. Others accused him of making trouble. One anonymous voicemail warned him to stop stirring the pot. He deleted it without responding, but the real test came at the next HOA meeting. This time, a handful of residents showed up who hadn't been there before, people who'd seen the news clip. One woman stood up and asked, "Why wasn't Mr. Ellery given a gate code if he's been using that road for decades?" Another man questioned why the HOA was spending dues money on a fence that might not even be on their property. Lyle, the HOA president, looked flustered. He mumbled something about pending legal review and community standards but the confidence was gone from his voice. The board voted to table the issue for further study. Deshawn didn't celebrate. He knew this wasn't over. But for the first time, he saw cracks in the wall they'd built, not just in the ground, but in their story. Back at the ranch, he watered his garden under the setting sun. His tomatoes were ripening and the calves were gaining weight. Life went on even when the path forward was blocked. But now he had something he didn't before, clarity. The land with the gate wasn't theirs. It belonged to the Garzas. And if they were willing to talk, maybe, just maybe, he could turn a locked gate into an open door. He wrote a letter that night. Simple, respectful, and to the point. He explained who he was, what had happened, and asked if they'd be open to a conversation. He included a copy of the deed, a photo of his grandfather standing on the same land in 1952, and his phone number at the bottom. He didn't know if they'd respond. But he'd done what he could. And in the quiet of the desert, where patience was as valuable as water, that was enough. For now. Weeks passed with no reply. Deshawn kept working, mending fences, rotating pastures, checking on newborn calves. But every time he passed the locked gate, he wondered if his letter had even been opened. Maybe the Garzas had moved again. Maybe they didn't care. Or maybe, like so many others, they just wanted to forget about a dusty piece of land they hadn't seen in years. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon while he was fixing a broken sprinkler line, his phone rang. The area code was Albuquerque. His heart jumped, but he kept his voice steady. "Hello? Is this Deshawn Ellery?" a woman asked. Her voice was soft, with a slight rasp, like someone who'd spent a lifetime talking over wind and radio static. "Yes, ma'am. This is Elena Garza." He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans even though she couldn't see him. "Ms. Garza, thank you for calling." There was a pause. Then she said, "I got your letter. And the photo. My husband, Mateo," he cried when he saw it. "That's him in the background, isn't it? Standing next to your grandfather?" Deshawn blinked. "Yes, that was taken in 52. They were fixing a windmill together after a sandstorm." Elena let out a quiet laugh. "Mateo never forgets a face or a favor. He said your grandfather helped them when their truck broke down on the county road. Gave them water, let them use his phone, even fed them dinner." Deshawn hadn't known that part. His grandfather rarely talked about the people he'd helped, only that the land takes care of those who take care of it. They talked for nearly an hour. Elena explained that they'd bought the small strip of land decades ago as part of a larger investment, but when the subdivision plans changed, they'd been left with just the access parcel, 0.3 acres, mostly dirt, and a few scrub oaks. They'd paid taxes on it out of habit, never thinking it would matter. When the HOA started sending notices about shared infrastructure, they assumed it was routine and signed a vague permission form without reading it closely. "We didn't know they'd build a gate," she said, her voice tinged with regret, "and we certainly didn't know they'd lock someone out." Deshaun didn't blame them. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, the kind that doesn't come from scripts or legal advisors, but from real people who'd made an honest mistake. "Would you be willing to sell the parcel?"
he asked gently.
"Not to spite anyone. Just so I can keep my ranch running and make sure no one else gets shut out like this." Another long pause. Then, "We'd like to meet you first." A week later, Deshaun cleaned his truck, put on his least-worn shirt, and drove to Albuquerque. The Garzas lived in a modest stucco house with a well-kept garden and a porch swing that squeaked in the breeze. Mateo, now in his late 80s, stood to greet him with a firm handshake and eyes that held decades of desert sun. Over sweet tea and homemade empanadas, they talked not just about land but about family, droughts, the changing West. Mateo remembered when cattle trails crossed where subdivisions now stood. Elena recalled how she and her husband used to picnic on that very access road, watching hawks circle overhead. By the time Deshaun left, they'd agreed in principle. They'd sell him the parcel. But Elena added one condition, looking him straight in the eye.
"Promise us you won't do to others what they did to you."
"Keep the gate open for the neighbors who live there. Not because they deserve it, but because you're better than that." Deshaun didn't hesitate. "I promise." Back home, he contacted the land use attorney again. She helped draft a clean purchase agreement and confirmed there were no liens or hidden claims on the property. The price was modest, far less than what Deshaun expected, but it still meant making hard choices. He couldn't afford it outright, so he made calls. Not to banks, but to people who understood what this land meant. He reached out to a regional cooperative of Black and Indigenous farmers who'd supported each other through droughts, policy fights, and market crashes. Within days, they offered a short-term loan, not as a business transaction, but as an act of solidarity. "We've all been blocked at some point," one elder told him. "This isn't just your fight. It's ours too." While paperwork moved through county offices, Deshaun kept quiet. He didn't post updates, didn't hint at what was coming. He just kept showing up, feeding his animals, tending his garden, taking the long way around the fence. But inside, a quiet fire burned. Not anger, purpose. Meanwhile, the HOA grew nervous. Rumors started circulating in Sagebrush Estates that Deshaun was planning something. Lyle called an emergency meeting, warning residents about outside agitators and property disputes. But this time, fewer people showed up. Some had begun to wonder if the fence had been a mistake. Others had seen Deshaun helping a lost hiker or sharing extra hay with a neighbor during a feed shortage. Actions spoke louder than bylaws. One evening, as Deshaun sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mesas gold, his phone buzzed. It was the county recorder's office. The deed transfer was complete. The 0.3-acre parcel, with the gate, the access road, and every inch of disputed ground, was now legally his. He didn't cheer, didn't rush to the fence. He just sat there for a long time, listening to the crickets and the distant lowing of his cattle. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Land isn't just dirt, son. It's memory. It's promise. And if you honor it, it'll carry you when your legs get tired." The next morning, before sunrise, Deshaun drove to the gate. He carried a small toolkit and a new keypad unit he'd bought the day before. He disconnected the old system, the one controlled by the HOA, and installed his own. This one had two settings, one that opened for all Sagebrush Estates residents during daylight hours, and another, biometric, tied to his fingerprint that gave him access anytime. No questions asked, he tested it. The gate slid open smoothly, silently. No alarms, no drama. Just metal moving on metal, like a door finally swinging wide after years of being stuck. He stood there for a moment, looking down the road that led to his home. Then he turned and walked back to his truck. There'd be time for meetings, for paperwork, for explaining things to the HOA. But today he had calves to check on, a garden to water, and a promise to keep. The land was open again, and this time he'd make sure it stayed that way, not with fences, but with fairness. The morning after the gate clicked open under his own control, Deshaun didn't rush to make a scene. He fed the calves, checked the water lines, and fixed a loose hinge on the barn door, same as any other day. But something had shifted in the air, like the quiet before a storm breaks or the calm after it passes. He could feel it in the way the wind moved through the cottonwoods, lighter somehow, freer. He waited until midweek to attend the HOA meeting. Not because he was nervous, he wasn't, but because he wanted to give himself time to prepare. He printed 3 copies of the new deed, highlighted the legal description of the parcel, and tucked them into a manila folder. He wore his usual work shirt, clean but not pressed, boots dusty from morning chores. He didn't want to look like he was coming to gloat. He was coming to clarify. The clubhouse was fuller than usual. Word had spread. Some neighbors looked curious. Others avoided his eyes. Lyle sat at the front table, jaw tight, fingers drumming on a stack of papers like he was bracing for impact. When the floor opened for community input, Deshaun stood. No dramatic pause, no raised voice. Just calm, clear words. "I'm here to share an update," he said. "Last week I purchased the 0.3-acre parcel that includes the access road and the gate you installed. The deed is now in my name. That means the gate, and the land it sits on, is no longer under HOA control." A murmur rippled through the room. Lyle's face went pale, then flushed red. "That's impossible," he blurted. "We have agreements." "Legal easements," Deshaun nodded. "You had an agreement with the previous owners, but they didn't transfer ownership to you, just permission to use the road. And that permission didn't include locking out existing landowners with legal access rights." He walked to the front and placed 1 copy of the deed on the table. The county recorder's office confirmed the transfer. "You're welcome to verify it." Lyle flipped through the pages, his hand shaking slightly. He tried to argue, to cite bylaws and community safety protocols, but his words sounded hollow now, like a radio playing static. The board members exchanged glances. One woman raised her hand. "So, does this mean the gate will stay locked?" she asked. "No," Deshaun said. "Starting today, the gate will open automatically for all Sagebrush Estates residents between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. You won't need codes. You won't need key fobs. Just drive up and it'll open." He paused, letting that sink in. "But I also added a backup system so I can access my ranch anytime, day or night, without relying on anyone's permission." "That's not a threat. It's just common sense," silence followed. Not the tense kind, but the thoughtful kind. The kind that comes when people realize the story they've been told might not be the whole truth. After the meeting, a few neighbors approached him. One man thanked him for keeping the gate open. Another asked if he'd consider joining a new landowner committee they were forming, one that included both residential and agricultural properties. Deshaun said he'd think about it. Lyle didn't speak to him again that night. But as Deshaun walked out to his truck, he saw the HOA president standing alone by the parking lot, staring at the ground like he was trying to figure out how the ground had moved under his feet. Back at the ranch, Deshaun didn't celebrate with fireworks or social media posts. He sat on his porch with a bowl of stew his neighbor Ray had dropped off, watching the last light fade behind the red rocks. The gate was open. His driveway was his again. But more than that, he'd shown that quiet persistence could move walls, even ones made of steel and bureaucracy. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. The gate worked exactly as he'd promised, opening smoothly for delivery trucks, school buses, and evening joggers from the subdivision. Some residents waved when they passed. Others still kept their distance, but even they seemed less tense, like the air had cleared. Deshaun used the peace to focus on what mattered most: the land. He planted a new row of drought-resistant fruit trees along the eastern fence line. He started a composting system using manure and kitchen scraps, turning waste into something that fed the soil. And every Saturday morning he opened his gates for the youth workshops again. Only now, a few kids from Sagebrush Estates showed up too, curious about chickens, irrigation, and how to tell if a plant was thirsty just by looking at its leaves. One afternoon, a young girl, maybe 10 years old, asked him, "Why did they lock you out?" Deshawn didn't give her a lecture about property law or HOA overreach. He just knelt beside her and pointed to a line of ants carrying seeds across the dirt. Sometimes, he said, people build walls because they're afraid of what they don't understand. But the land doesn't care about fences. It just wants to grow. And if you listen close enough, it teaches you how to live with others, even the ones who don't see things the same way. She nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Maybe she'd carry that with her. Meanwhile, the HOA quietly updated its bylaws. A notice went out to all residents announcing a new policy. All property owners with legal easements, agricultural, commercial, or residential, would now be included in access decisions. It wasn't a grand apology, but it was a start. Deshawn kept his promise to the Garzas. He never shut anyone out. In fact, when a winter storm knocked down a power line near the subdivision's edge, he let the utility crew use his driveway to reach the damage faster. No charge, no conditions. People noticed, not in headlines or viral videos, but in small ways. A thank you note left on his mailbox, an extra pie at the community potluck, a teenager asking if he could volunteer on the ranch to earn hours for school. Deshawn didn't keep score. He just kept showing up, steady, kind, and firm when he needed to be, because he knew something deeper than ownership. True belonging isn't about who controls the gate. It's about who keeps it open for others. And as the desert bloomed after a rare spring rain, painting the hills in purple and gold, Deshawn stood at his gate, not as a man who'd won a battle, but as one who'd helped build a bridge. Quietly, patiently, the way his grandfather would have wanted.